In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
You know, it's funny because I think it's less about the technology. I think it's less about the technical piece and it's more about the people-centric value piece. It's about the strategy and your values as an organization as to what you believe the value that talent brings, how you want to cultivate that talent, how you see talent, and what your attitude is towards your people. Because you can have 5 different companies that are using the same tool, but they can use it in 5 different ways depending on what's most important to them. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but even though we're getting more technologically advanced, I would actually say it's more important now than ever to stop and make sure that you really understand what your values are.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers on social media. For more, check out our archive at agabayer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 22. First of all, I wanted to thank all the listeners who have submitted questions for our guests so far. Jessica, Mina, Red, Jeff, Sarah, Kip, Eduardo, Mike, Christian, thank you. And I'd also like to encourage the rest of you who listen to the podcast to connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook, I'm Aga Bayer, or on Twitter at Coach Aga, and send us questions for our upcoming guests, because it's really wonderful to hear your voices on the podcast, but also our guests really enjoy hearing from you and finding out what really interests you. So I'm recording this during the longest stretch of time that I spent at home since last year. And it's been really great because I've been able to focus on the sort of work that, at least for me, calls for longer, uninterrupted stretches of time. And all sorts of creative work like writing my new book, creating this podcast, my blog, designing programs, they somehow seem to come along easier when I wake up in the morning and I know that today I have 3 or 4 hours of uninterrupted time to just make new stuff. And speaking of creative work and what it takes to be able to be innovative, I have a very interesting guest today, Rahaf Harfoush. And she's in the process of writing a book on this very subject. It's called Hustle and Float, and it explores our contemporary work culture. And one of the key messages of that book is that human beings need periods of activity and periods of downtime to be able to be creative and innovative. Rahaf Harfoush is a strategist, digital anthropologist, and best-selling author who focuses on the intersections between emerging technology, innovation, and digital culture. Her second book, The Dakota Company, Know Your Talent Better Than You Know Your Customers, was a New York Times and USA Today bestseller, and it also won Gold Axiom Award. Rahaf is the founder of Red Thread. It's a think tank and a special projects agency, and they support organizations in transforming digital trends into strategic opportunities. She's super smart, she's fun, and she loves dogs, so she's my kind of person, and I hope that you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed speaking to Rahaf. Rahaf, welcome to Culture Lab.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to have you. I would like to start our interview slightly differently this time. Your dog, Pixel, she has an Instagram account and it says that she loves long walks, apples and chicken. Do they ever happen all at once?
On her birthday.
Oh, wow.
On her birthday, we give her all of those things, a mix of her favorite things. Yes, I know she has her own Instagram account, but in my defense, it was because I was getting complaints that I was posting too many pictures of her to my Instagram account. So I did it as like a public service,
I see.
So,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you on behalf of all the followers. But actually, chicken and apples, it seems to be a thing. Do you know the stand-up comedian? His name is Jim Jeffries.
No.
And so he just had his new Netflix special released.
Okay.
And one of the things that he talks about is how his son only eats 4 different meals, and one of them is chicken with apples. So, I was curious about Pixel, if she sort of accompanies her chicken with apples, or do they come separately?
I think they come separately for her as a little snack versus, a dinner. But I didn't know that, actually. I didn't know that this was actually a thing. I thought it was a bizarre taste profile of my dog.
Here you go. It is a thing. Well, I have to say, Rahaf, Pixel seems to have a really good life. Actually, I think that I envy her life a little bit, just looking at her profile.
She's very spoiled. She seems
to be spoiled, yeah.
I mean, she's living the Parisian dream, so what more do you want?
Exactly. Not only she lives in Paris, and not only she gets those long walks, apples and chicken, but she also gets to travel all around the world, basically.
I mean, she's pretty spoiled. She's been to a lot of places. She's been all over France. She's been all over Italy. She's been to Amsterdam, to Geneva, to New York, to California, to Toronto.
Oh my God.
She's a little jet setter. So one of the last hotels we went to actually had like a doggy sort of spa situation. So she got a little doggy massage while I was.
Oh my God. This is just crazy.
I know. I mean, it's one indulgence in life. Like I don't do anything. I don't even, do anything like super crazy. But for this dog, I will do the doggy massages. And we've started this interview with me talking about dog massages. So I wonder how seriously your listeners are going to take me now.
Yeah, normally we start those interviews asking about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. What made Rahaf?
That is a good question. I mean, I think if I had to look back on my journey, I think probably one of the biggest influences was my relationship with my father, who I'm very close to. And he has always been a sci-fi guy. I grew up watching Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica and reading Isaac Asimov and all of this sort of thing. And through that, I have always grown up with a big sense of wonder around technology, a sense of what it could do, how it could change the world that we live in. And so I've always grown up in this place that looks at the fusion of human potential and technology, thanks to my dad's influence and thanks to the books that he read and the ideas that he shared with me. And he's an engineer and he works a lot with computers as a big background, taking them apart and building software and things like that. And so on top of that, I actually got to see from a present perspective, just the amazing benefits of having a computer. I remember, not to date myself, but I remember having to write out essays by hand before we got a word processor. And I remember learning how to type. And I remember, so, when you combine it with the sense of wonder and the sense of how technology could really amplify humanity, both in good and bad ways, I grew up with a love of the unknown, a love of science, a love of pursuing these big questions. I was rereading the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov recently. I don't know if you have read those books, but
I tried. I had a boyfriend many years ago, and he was a huge fan.
Yeah.
And so I wanted, to be able to know what he was reading, but I just didn't. I don't know. It just didn't do it for me.
I mean, if you were to revisit them, you would. I'm starting to believe that he was an actual time traveler who came to the future and saw how things were. And so my father, exposed me to Jules Verne and, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and all of these big thinkers that were inventing these fantastical machines that were helping humans to unlock new frontiers. And I always thought that captivated my imagination in a way. And it's that imagination, it's that desire to understand what's out there beyond the world that we know now, beyond the life that we're living now, all of this big sense of possibility that I think has been very instrumental to me as a person, but also in my work.
Yeah, I can imagine, because I think if there is a common thread between all our guests up until now, is that family and our parents particularly, of course, play a huge role in shaping us. And when you are exposed to those things since early childhood, it's almost inevitable that you will eventually find it again in your life later on. And very often it is connected to what people are doing professionally. So I can see it makes sense to me why you would end up doing what you are doing. And one of your titles is actually a digital anthropologist. So can you say for people, what does a digital anthropologist do?
It's just about the intersection of technology and culture, but looking at how it's influencing the way we fall in love, or the way we raise our children, or the way we travel or learn or engage with new ideas, the way we form community. All of those things are being impacted by technology in an unprecedented way. I don't think it's ever been like this before in the history of our species. And so I find it a very fascinating time to re-examine what it means to be human in an age of constant connection.
You were a member of Barack Obama's digital media team during the 2008 presidential elections. What was that like?
It was an incredible experience. I was surrounded by some of the smartest and most passionate people that I had ever met. People who had left jobs at Facebook and Google and Twitter to come and work on this cause. And I thought there was something that was very inspiring about their energy and their motivation. And being Canadian, I wasn't as vested as they were in terms of their their elections, but there was something about seeing very smart people that were legitimately trying to do what they thought was right and to have a positive impact and to make the world a little bit of a better place was just incredibly inspiring. I mean, I just was blown away by their intelligence and their persistence and their determination. And so being a part of that movement and then witnessing how we were riding a wave as more and more people joined the cause. And it was the exact epitome of what I thought the potential of this technology was, which is connecting millions of people who otherwise would have not been able to connect with each other, mobilizing them, mobilizing their finances, and enabling them to go out and have a tangible impact on the offline world. In this case, it was getting at the vote. It was getting people registered to vote. It was getting people to go vote. It was getting people to donate money. That culminated in electing, President Barack Obama.
And I think out of that experience, your first book was born, right? Because you did write a book about what it was like to use all that technology to help Barack Obama be elected in the United States. So would you like to share with us what you've learned through this book writing process, but also obviously being part of that campaign in terms of that intersection of technology and our culture?
I think for me, the biggest lesson was this connection between the online and offline space. That up until that time, at least for myself, the division had been very clear. There was the online world and there was the offline world. There was the world of ICQ and AOL and MSN Messenger and MySpace, and to some extent Facebook, where, you just had this persona online. And then there was the offline world, which in many cases was separate. So I felt like this was the first time that the bridge between the two had been built in a very quantifiable way, that we could directly track the money coming in to the micro donations that were coming in, that we could track the polls and track the voter turnout to the vote organizing initiatives that we were doing on the platform. So to be able to see in a measurable way, in a quantifiable way, the influence of that technology on a political playbook that up until that time hadn't really changed that much in the last, say, 8 to 10 years. So all of a sudden we had these new tools that could be used, and they were completely rewriting how political campaigns were being run. And so for me, that was the biggest takeaway, was just understanding that this could be the tip of the iceberg, that we were seeing a suite of tools that were being created that were going to have an incredible impact, but on our offline world. So that was my first real lesson in the link between online and offline.
Yeah. And so taking it historically, so your first book was about your participation and what those tools did for the Obama campaign. And your second book was the Dakota Company. And you co-authored it with 3 other people, right? And you talk in this book quite a lot about how important it is to know your employees as intimately as knowing your customers, because it can have huge benefits. And you talk about that digital identity and how important it is in companies. So can you talk to us a little bit about what those benefits are?
Yeah, so, I've always had a very people-centric approach in my work, and the Decoded Company was a book that said, or the thesis of that book was that talent is the most important thing that you can have in your business, and that talent is going to be the make or break of determining whether or not a company was going to thrive, whether it was going to succeed, or whether it was going to fail. And we have all of these tools to understand how consumers think and what consumers want and what they're going to buy. But a lot of companies were not using those same tools to look inwards to better understand what motivates their top talent. And so we wanted to create a strategy book that showed, or that made the case for why using data in an ethical way to better understand your talent was going to be incredibly important. Because if you can understand your talent and motivate them and keep them happy in the giant global talent shortage that we're experiencing, that was going to be the difference between the companies who survived and the companies that didn't.
And so it's really quite fascinating, because your co-authors actually created, they are founders of a company that is called Click Health, right?
Yes.
And they actually use those technologies in their own company as well. They have this, I don't know, is it a software or an application called Genome? What is it? How do you call it, first of all? And how do they use it? Exactly for those reasons, because you say there's huge potential definitely to identify what motivates our people, what lights them up, what interests them, and then, as you say, ethically using that to create a better environment for everyone. So going back and rewinding, what is Genome and how does it help them to achieve all those benefits that you talked about?
Sure. So Click Health is a digital agency that focuses on the pharmaceutical space, the healthcare space. They have about 800 people, offices in Toronto and New York. And Genome was a software that they built in-house themselves as a way to better understand what their people were doing, what they were working on, and how they could help them achieve their goals better. So Genome, very simply, is just a system that it's almost like a hive mind. It's almost like the central system that keeps track of everything that's happening in the company. So budgets and timelines and, who's managing what and what clients are expecting what at what time and how many projects a project manager is in charge of. So it manages all of that into one integrated system. And what that allows them to do in a very simplified terms is that it allows them to be able to see a deeply integrated perspective of the health of a project or the health of their company. So they can see, because the system it measures, for example, the time that it takes to work on something. It measures the workload of an individual project manager and an individual designer or an account manager. So they can very quickly see that if somebody is like overworked, or if somebody has too much on their plate it's a resourcing issue, it flags it in the system and it says, hey guys, it looks like this person has way more work than they can normally handle. And by sort of sending out these flags early on, or hey guys, it looks like the budget for this that we quoted this client, it looks like it's not going to be enough for the next 2-3 stages that we had originally planned. So what that enables them to do is it enables them to have a very proactive response and not a reactive. Instead of waiting until that poor project manager is burnt out and is sick and he quits, it immediately flags the system and it says, hey, maybe Mark has too much on his plate. We should see if we need to reallocate some of those resources and make sure that he has an easier workload.
So I understand that it raises those flags, but I suppose that then, of course, you have a conversation and you have a dialogue about those things with people, because I imagine that what for Mark is an overwhelming situation, for Jane, it must be, just a fantastic challenge, and she might be feeling actually energized by having all these tasks and having so many things to do on that particular project.
Yes, that's exactly it. And in the book, we say that data is something that should be used to help influence your decision, to help you make a decision, but it's not making the decision in your place. Mm-hmm. And we find that data points are generally a very good way to just start a conversation. So instead of coming and saying, hey, Mark, you look really overworked, which maybe is not the best way to go about it, or hey, you're looking really tired today. It's one thing to say, hey, Mark, I'm just checking in. It says on the system that you've got, I'm just making up a number here. So, that you've got 70 hours of work allocated this week. We just wanted to check in with you and make sure that you're okay.
And it's also, from what I'm hearing from you, it's really transparent. So as you say, you're not trying to say, oh, you look tired, but you are very transparent. You say it says on the system that this and this is happening, and just checking with the person.
Yes.
Which I think is quite important as well, because you mentioned that ethical issue. And I think that one of the considerations for a lot of people in using those technologies is that, the company knows and uses data about you that you are not aware of, or you don't know how it's going to be used. So to me, I think it's important to be very, very transparent about how you use these data, and also giving the person an opportunity to react to it.
Well, that's exactly it. And so the cultural piece of why I found this project and this book to be so fascinating was that we were seeing at the time a lot of companies that were racing to put these big data systems inside their organizations, and nobody was talking about it from a cultural issue. So we wanted to make sure that we created what we call, the policies for ethical data practices, that were 3 general guidelines that companies should use in order for them to ensure that their practices are aligned with their values. And so, for example, the first one, like you said, is transparency. It should be very, very clear to everyone. There should be no secrets of what's being recorded, what's being tracked, how long that information stays in the database, etc. The second thing is that the information that is being collected falls under what we call the public record, which means we're not tracking people's private lives. We're not tracking people's private or personal details. We're tracking things like budgets and client load and hours, like things that if your manager came up to your desk and said, what are you working on? Or, what's the budget for this project? You wouldn't be like, well, that's a secret. That's personal, Like, we're tracking things that are quite relevant to job performance and quite relevant to the company. So we're not infringing on anybody's personal or private life. And then the third is really just about opting in and about telling people that this is what's being done with their data. And we found that when you have a culture in place that doesn't use data punitively, you're never going to say, oh, hey, Mark, you're not working enough, or you're not doing this. It's always used in a very humane way. Then people generally are happy with those ethical data policies because it's making their lives a bit easier and there's no surprises. And I think that's the biggest thing. I think people need to be very aware of what is being tracked and how it's being used. But most people are quite reasonable. And if they understand how it relates directly to their job, then they're going to be okay with it.
So I have a question related to your second point, which is about the public sort of profile and public information, because I think the line between public and private sometimes can be very thin. And for example, with technologies like emotional AI, where, right, your facial expressions are being sort of interpreted, it's hard to say, is it still private or is it public? It's happening on the outside, but I think it's a reflection of your internal world, and very often things that perhaps you wouldn't like to share with your boss. So what's your view on that?
I mean, I am a privacy advocate, so I'm always going to err on the side of giving people more privacy, not less privacy. I think things like facial expressions and, I mean, that's when you really have to start having conversations about what you're trying to do, right? Because if the thing is like you're using facial expressions. So one of the examples about actually facial recognition AI specifically is that it's being used more and more in recruiting. And when people are recruiting or interviewing for a job, they will record a video of themselves answering a few questions, and that video gets analyzed by very sophisticated AI that tries to see if you're lying or if you're, telling, if there's something suspicious about your behavior. I mean, I find that really creepy, and I find that it's one of those things where it's a data point that can make or break someone's career, make or break someone getting a job or passing an interview based on, I think, something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. What if you're really nervous that day? What if there's all sorts of other things. And so to me, I don't know, I don't really like those types of applications, because I think that if the goal is that we want to find people that are a better fit, I think there are other ways to go about that. So I always think, like, what is the end goal that we're trying to use with these technologies? And I just feel like sometimes we let the technology race ahead and we think, oh, facial expressions, micro expressions, sure, sounds great. But the reality of that experience kind of assumes that people are hiding something, right? As a baseline, it almost assumes that we're running your video through this algorithm because you might be hiding something.
Well, I think it depends, because speaking about this end goal, I talked to Tim and Young, who works with Unilever, who actually is using one of those applications of the company that I think is called Higher View.
Yes.
And right, and they want the benefits. One of the benefits that they've seen is that the diversity of their hires has gone up like crazy, because they believe they have been able to eliminate human bias from those interviews. So, and I think that someone could argue, well, yes, our end goal was to eliminate bias in our hires. That's why we use this technology. But as you say, there are many other different aspects to that. And again, nothing is black and white, it seems, with this new technology.
But I think so. I'm familiar with that Unilever example, and the thing that increased their diversity wasn't the video recording; it was the interactive cognitive games that measured certain characteristics of how people responded to risk, how they collaborated, how they thought under pressure, and that by using people's results of that interactive game, it allowed them to get a far more diverse set of candidates, because they weren't using traditional markers, the school you went to, and your GPA, et cetera, et cetera. So in that respect, I think that systems like that are very interesting, but I don't think they didn't 100% depend on the video recording. For me, I was about the facial recording that I just seem to, I'm not sold on it. I think if it's, at the airport and we're trying to prevent terrorism, sure, but I just don't think that the average employee needs that level of security.
I agree with you. I think it really does sound creepy. I've seen recently in the news somewhere that in China they're using this now in schools.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, the final sort of outcome or objective is, of course, very noble because they say they just want to know whether kids have a difficulty in understanding or following the lesson or whatever. But it creeps me out, I have to say.
But that being said, though, the video stuff is a whole other conversation aside. I do think that it's very interesting, the things like the cognitive games and the different ways that allow people to showcase different skill sets. That way, if you might not interview well or something, that you still have a chance. I think those are great. But when we start evaluating people's micro expressions, I guess at this point in time, it's putting a little too much trust in those algorithms.
Yes. Yeah. So one last question about the digital profiles and ambient data that companies are using before we talk about your new book, because I'm quite excited to find out about your new book as well. One of the things that I'm personally really interested in is how these technologies can be used in cultivating a culture of continuous learning. Mm-hmm. And I know that you have some experience with that. So could you talk to us a little bit about what's happening already and what is the potential for the future?
Sure. So one of the biggest changes that has happened in organizational culture is that the speed of technology and the fact that it's moving so fast has made it impossible to not be constantly updating your skill set, your best practices, and your analysis of what's happening in the market. So for the first time, if you think about 20 years ago, you used to be able to go to school, get a degree, and then have that degree hold you, have that degree be everything that you needed for the rest of your working career, right? And now what we're seeing is that things are moving so fast. New business models, new entrants into the markets, new technologies, new best practices, new government policies, all of these things that are happening that are changing the way business is being done. So today's knowledge worker, today's worker has to be sort of constantly updating and analyzing and learning. And that's a really big change because traditionally we've had a very, end point view of education where you go to school and there's an end point and then you exit and that's it. And so now we're starting to see this big psychological shift. And I think in organizations, that's huge because many organizations now are starting to invest in learning and development. They're starting to invest in a lot of these online trainings. They're starting to offer different programs for their employees to keep updating their skill set. And I think the biggest shift has been, and at least from my experience in speaking to both L&D professionals as well as C-suite executives, is that traditionally the employee learning has been seen as a nice to have. We're providing our employees with this course. It's like a very nice to have, and it's actually shifting into a need to have. And it's shifting into being a core part of the job description. So instead of, hey, go find some time to do this online course, it's like companies now are starting to think about how they can allocate certain percentages of a person's role in order to have time to learn and assess and adjust. And the companies that aren't doing that are, I find, sometimes faltering a little bit because they're constantly being responsive. And if you're constantly reactive and constantly responding to things that are happening in the market instead of trying to understand what this means for the future of your business, then if you're always responding, then technically you're sort of always a step behind almost of the change.
So the need is definitely there, and the changes are really rapid, as you say. So people have to continuously upskill and keep up with technology. And I'm curious, are you aware of any ways that companies are already using technology to understand what people's learning needs are? So, instead of asking people, what do you need to learn? Employing artificial intelligence or whatever it is to give them or analyze that data that is probably out there in order to create, say, development plans for people.
Yeah, and I'll actually go back to Genome because I think Click Health has a really great example of this, which is what they do is that because this software sort of knows everything that's happening inside the company. Over the course of the past several years that it has been used, what's happened is that the computer has now a pretty good idea of what specific skill sets a particular role requires, because it's managing over 800 people. So it knows, 100 project managers, 100 account managers, 100 marketing, 100 accountants. So by seeing all of these people doing these jobs, it's been able to break down and understand what the ideal or what the best mix of skill sets are, which means that when you come into the system, Genome actually knows what projects you've worked on, what types of projects you've worked on before, what types of clients you've worked on before, what colleagues you've worked with before, and it holds that up against the highest performing profiles. And it says, hey, you might need to work on a couple more of these bigger budget projects in order for you to up your skill set, or you might need to know how to do this specific skill on this type of project with this type of client. So it will actually start suggesting projects and tasks for you to fill any gaps that it might see. And those are gaps that you might not even know yourself you have, but that the system kind of says, hey, project managers at your level with your experience tend to do better if they take this course or that course, or if they work with this team. And so it really helps you sort of build a stronger profile.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And I can see how that can work with all sorts of technical skills. But I'm curious, is there a way also to do that with the so-called soft skills, which are not soft really? What are they doing about that? Like, empathy and an ability to manage others, et cetera, et cetera.
So from a cultural perspective, one of the ways that they use data is they have a very strong digital internal culture. And so one of the things that they do is that they use that to model ideal behavior that they want other people to emulate, or, values and practice, as they say. So one of the ways that they do that is they have an internal, Twitter channel. And one of the policies, or one of the things that they do, is a thing called kudos, which is when your colleague does something nice for you, or helps you out, then you go on this channel, or, and you type, thanks, Mark, for managing that project, and you hashtag it kudos. And eventually there are people start seeing all of these examples of behavior, and it's done a couple of really interesting things. One, it's enabled people to show positive and concrete ways of helping each other. So they found an increase of people sort of doing these acts and being more helpful, but it's also increase the thankfulness of the culture. People are much more thankful to their colleagues for recognizing when somebody helps them out. And then finally, it just creates a way for people inside the organizations to kind of get to know each other less from this is Mark from project management, but more about, this is Mark. He's a guy who always, helps other teams out, or, it kind of gives us more human kind of value-based system for how people are acting inside the company. And that sort of thing, I think, has fostered a much higher culture of empathy and of helpfulness and of being nice. And it's a way where people, they like the recognition that they get from their colleagues, from the company. The company has screens everywhere, all over the office, so that you can see this constant stream of kudos that are coming up. And then, once a month, all the people that received kudos, they get celebrated, they get recognition. So it's a way where they're rewarding a very specific set of behaviors, being kind, being helpful, being resourceful, being collaborative. And those are, the data is sort of being used in that way to promote that type of profile.
So it's almost like a live 360, because people get feedback. It's just that it's acknowledgement in this case. People get feedback,
but they're also being
all
thanked.
The time.
So generally it's a stream of positivity, right? No one is saying you suck for not doing this. So also from just a morale perspective, it's also nice to just sort of be seeing people rewarded for doing good.
Totally. So is there a scenario there where, for example, you are assigned a new project, and as you said, the genome has created that profile of what the role, what the project requires, and what the best performing project managers in similar projects had to do, and then what was your experience, and comparing that, and then saying to a person, well, one thing that this project needs is being really collaborative with others, and we haven't seen enough kudos for being collaborative on your part, so you will need to improve that. Is that scenario playing out there sometimes?
I haven't seen that specific aspect, but what it does do from a collaboration aspect is it'll say, hey, Mark, you've never done this type of project before. So when it generates the to-do, like it generates almost a to-do list of what you need to do for each step of the project. And that to-do list actually depends on your level of experience and the number of similar projects you've done in the past. So if it's my first project, I might get a to-do list of 20 things. And if it's Mark's 10th project, he might get a to-do list of 10 things because the system understands that he knows. What it does do is it would encourage him to speak to other people. So the collaborative aspect is actually built into the to-do list depending on, where they are. So if I'm a beginner, I might get a thing that says, hey, you know what? Mark has done 25 types of these projects. You should go talk to him. And then that will sort of encourage relationship building that way as well.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not used necessarily to show someone, oh, here's your weakness. It's more to encourage the person to take action and reach out to others, etc., etc.
Well, the system is built to recognize that everyone has a different skill set and everyone's at a different place in their expertise. And the system should be able to meet, like instead of a one size fits all, instead of a 25-point checklist that stays the same no matter who you are, the system says, you know what, if you're a beginner, you might need a couple of extra steps because you're learning, and that's okay. You can watch this video a few times, and that's, you can ask as many questions as you want, and that's okay. It's sort of making learning and gaining new skills an acceptable part, which sounds like really obvious, but when you think about it, the role of expertise in organizations has always been that you're supposed to know everything at your job.
Absolutely.
And so it's always switching it in a very subtle way of saying, look, as a learning organization, there's always going to be stuff that you're going to have to learn. And the system is built to help you maximize it. It's not going to shame you. It's not going to judge you if you have to watch an instructional video 2 or 3 times. It's not going to get mad at you that you still, didn't get it. What the system is going to do is it's going to build your confidence by giving you the level of tasks that you need so that it minimizes the chance of mistakes. And that also helps the company on the other end have a higher quality and a more consistent quality, because all the output gets the same level of quality, even if like the way that people did the projects might vary depending on their own expertise and their own profile.
Wow, it sounds like a very smart system, I have to say.
Yeah, when I first started the project and got invited to go see the system, I spent a lot of time interviewing people, seeing the system, checking out the features, and I was just completely blown away by how not only sophisticated it was, but how the technology was being used to foster a very specific human culture, that every single thing that the technology did and the role that it was supposed to do was in making it a better place for people to work and making people more collaborative, helping people be happier, helping people feel recognized. So going back to the Barack Obama example, it was like, once again, it was like the tangible, quantifiable impact of this technology on a company's culture. And in this case, they have very low turnover rates at the company because people are happy and they feel rewarded and recognized and they feel like they have autonomy. And so all of those things makes them a great company that attracts a lot of top talent.
Yeah. So it seems it works. And if I were to ask you, having seen this, because you've actually had personal experience, you've been there, and as you said, you looked at the system, you analyzed it. So could you make a forecast for the future, how that sort of technology can play a role in helping organizations cultivate a culture that will help them to be successful and bring their vision to life?
It's funny because I think it's less about the technology. I think it's less about the technical piece and it's more about the people centric value piece. It's about the strategy and your values as an organization as to what you believe the value that talent brings, how you want to cultivate that talent, how you see talent, and what your attitude is towards your people. Because you can have 5 different companies that are using the same tool, but they can use it in 5 different ways depending on what's most important to them. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but even though we're getting more technologically advanced, I would actually say it's more important now than ever to stop and make sure that you really understand what your values are. And if you're a company that values, we value people, we value, we value equality, we value, everyone has these mission statements. You need to understand that the data, it's not just about like productivity. The data is about, okay, well, are you doing equal pay parity? Are you covering healthcare costs? Do you have maternal and paternal leave? It's not just about having a very fancy mission statement and fancy technology. It's how is the information that you're getting from that technology enabling you to put policy in place and actually reflect your values.
Correct. And I think that technology can actually help companies probably to do a reality check of how big a gap they have between their espoused values and what really happens in the organization. Because I think that sometimes you have that mismatch. And especially senior executives, they think that the rest of the organization for example, works with big emphasis on people's development and growth, but actually what happens in reality is different. And I imagine that technology probably can play a big role in sort of showing to people who need to do something about this that there is a gap and how big it is and maybe in which part so that something can be done about this.
Yeah, well, everyone thinks that technology is like a magic bullet. And in actuality, technology is a mirror. The technology will reflect everything that you believe right back at you. So if you believe that, people can't be trusted and they have to account for every single one of their minutes and every second they're at the job, the technology will reflect that. If you think that, people that like the technology will just basically reflect everything that you believe about the world right back at you. And so that's why there's punitive technology. There's like punitive data. There's imagine a company that measures door swipe data when you come in and when you come out, right? So it knows when you get into work and it knows when you leave work, which a lot of companies actually do. And a company that is very much about counting minutes and about being present, presenteeism, as they say, like making sure that there are butts in seats at certain times, that tool can be used quite punitively. It could just be like, you know what, Mark, like you came into work today at 9:15 instead of 9:00, like get it together, Another company that's using the same technology that doesn't really care about when its employees come in and when they leave, as long as they're doing their work, et cetera, they might see that Mark is staying late 2, 3, 4 nights in a row. And that might be, again, a point of departure for a conversation that says, hey, Mark, we're seeing that you're staying late. We're seeing that you're swiping out a lot later than usual. Is everything okay? Do you need an extra hand? Is there something going on that you want to talk about? So the same technology, one way it's used punitively and one way it's used as a way to establish trust and build relationships with your employees.
Yeah, completely agree with that. I think it's so true. And I think that what we see, at least with the clients that I speak, is that people get obsessed about what technology specifically they need to implement. They try to figure out what would be the best thing for them, but they don't think enough about all these issues that you mentioned, like what are our values, how are we going to use those tools, and how can we make sure that we really create that culture that is going to serve our mission and help us achieve our vision. So again, I think the future of work is still human from what you're saying as well. It's just that it's going to be enabled more effectively and more efficiently with some amazing tools.
Yeah, I just think it's a neutral layer. And whether it becomes a force for good or a force for evil, that depends on the people using it.
Yeah. So let's go to your new book. The title is Hustle and Float.
Yes.
So what's behind the title?
Well, hustle and float is a whitewater rafting term that describes the perfect whitewater rafting trip, which is a mix of hustling when you're paddling really hard and floating when you lift your paddle up and you just are cruising down the river. And if you hustle too much, if you paddle too much, you'll get tired, you'll make mistakes, you'll get exhausted, and that could actually put your life in danger because you're not paying as much attention to the river conditions. And if you float too much, well, then you're never going to go where you want to go, and you're sort of giving up control of that trip to the river. And so the perfect mix, as I was told by a friend who was a river guide, is this idea of the balance between hustling and floating. And I found that it was a very relevant metaphor to myself and my practice, being a knowledge worker, being a creative, in how I was constantly feeling like I couldn't keep up and I wasn't doing enough and I wasn't working hard enough or long enough. And it got to the point that the overwork that I was experiencing became very detrimental to my health. So this book started not because I was wondering what I could do, but because I was frustrated that I knew what to do, I knew better, and that I wasn't doing it. And so I was trying to understand, why is it that I know what I need to do in order to take better care of myself, but I don't do it? And the more...
So what did you find out?
So first I talked to over 100 entrepreneurs and artists and knowledge workers and managers and CEOs. And I realized that we have inherited a very powerful set of baggage, of ideologies about work, about being hardworking, about being productive, that has existed for hundreds of years. And that we are carrying all of this baggage with us, even though we're entering into a phase of work where the type of work that we're doing isn't at all the same type as this model that we've built. So we've built our entire history of work from the industrial era onwards has been built around this idea of productive output, of continuous output. I build widgets on a factory line and, I make X widgets every 8 hours, every single day, and that's my productive output. But now a lot of us are in the business of ideas, of solutions, of problem solving, of all of these cognitive skills, writing and analyzing. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a set rate of how many ideas I can come up with per hour. I found that my productive, my creativity sort of operated on a different metric, and yet I was still trying to hold it to a productivity system when that didn't make any sense. So the book just looks at where our beliefs around work come from and what happens when those beliefs meet this incredible era of disruptive technology and what it means for the future of work.
And that's really, really fascinating. And we actually have one of our listeners asking a question about your new book. Time for your questions.
Hi, Aga. This is Alison McTavish from Switzerland.
Hi, this is Dale Hintz. I'm submitting a question to the Culture Lab.
Hi, Aga. I just want to say thank you so much for doing the podcast.
I have a question for Culture Lab.
Hello, my name is Morten Abbey from Denmark.
Hi, Ed. This is Tim Coupler.
Hi, I'm Kostas. I have a question for you, Michael.
I'd love to hear your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for entertaining my question.
Hi, it's Christian. I have a question. And what I would like to know is, you're speaking about the hustle and flow as an alternative for just hustling. And can you explain the process you help business to go through to go from a just hustling culture to a hustle and flow culture? Thank you. Looking forward to.
Hi, Christian. Thank you for your question and thank you for listening. One of the ways that I help organizations to move away from simply a hustling culture into a hustle and flow culture is by getting together in teams and looking at what are the specific work belief behaviors that get exhibited in that specific team. So there is a sociological phenomena that's called work devotion. And work devotion is a learned social behavior that we have inherited, whereby we each try to prove to our coworkers and our colleagues that we deserve our jobs and we belong to be here, and that we deserve to be here, based on statements that show that we are determined and we're struggling and we're sacrificing for the job. So examples of this that you might see in your own life are if you ask somebody how they're doing at work and they say, "Oh, I'm so busy," or, "Oh, I pulled an all-nighter," or if people are sending emails at 6 o'clock in the morning and at 3 o'clock in the morning on the flip side, and if they're, really making this effort to show their visibility of how hard, how long, how much they're sacrificing.
It's almost like a badge of honor.
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. It's a badge of honor, and it's a way that I signal to you that I'm working hard and therefore I deserve to be here. So one of the first things that we do is we look at teams, we talk together with teams, and we try to see how these specific behaviors manifest in that team, because we all do it. I used to do it. My husband used to do it. My friends, some of them still do it. Everyone sort of does it in their own way. So
and sometimes, you've noticed people, I don't know if you've noticed that, Rahaf, with your friends, that the culture is shifting slightly. So people will still say that they are busy, but they will say it slightly more sheepishly. And then they will say, "But it's good kind of busy."
Yes. And actually it's become, now that I've done all this research, it's actually become one of my biggest pet peeves now when I hear people say that they're busy, but the good kind of busy. And it's kind of like, we've become a society obsessed with being busy. Busy's become a badge of honor. It's a signal of importance. And there's a lot of reasons. There's not enough hours to go into all of the reasons. The book really sort of highlights where this obsession with being busy has come from. But back to the question about teams. I'll give you an example. I was doing a workshop with a team, and it was a company that had a very big mission statement about work-life balance, and people were talking about work-life balance, and there was a bit of a tension in the room, and I couldn't figure out why. And so I asked the vice president, who's the manager of this group, to step out for a minute, and I looked at the rest of the team, and I said, "Guys, what's going on? What's this tension?" And then one of them finally says, "We say that we're a company that values work-life balance, but the VP, he's always sending us emails really late at night, really early in the morning, on the weekends, and he's the boss, so we have to answer." So I was like, "Okay, that's good. That's good to know that, brought him back in. And so, didn't tell him who said what, but was like, "Hey, what's going on about this? Why are you sending these emails?" And he, in his defense, was absolutely flabbergasted, because he didn't realize that the act of him sending those emails was pressuring his team to reply, to match his work behavior. He was just like, "Oh, I'm really busy during the day, and the only time I have to answer emails is at night and on the weekends. But I don't expect anyone from my team to answer me at night or on the weekends." And then there was a pause, and I said, "Okay, well, have you ever explicitly said this to people? Have you ever said to your team, 'I don't expect you to answer'?" And then he just got a sheepish look on his face, and he was like, "No, I just thought they knew." And so his team was relieved, because they're like, "We thought you wanted us to respond." And he was like, "No, I don't want you to respond. I want you to have your weekends and have your personal lives." And so they ended up coming up with a policy whereby you don't have to answer or respond to an email that comes in after 7 o'clock at night. And if there's an emergency, your colleague will call you on the phone.
That's fantastic. I had a very, very similar situation in a workshop as well, exactly the same scenario. And then people had a conversation in the workshop about those emails, those Sunday emails. And interestingly, some people wanted them to be sent on a Sunday, because then they knew they could come in on Monday and see what needs to be done and start prioritizing. But this discussion about you don't have to answer over the weekend was really, really important. It was exactly the same thing. So the director of that team, he never actually had this conversation with people, telling them, you don't, I send those emails on a Sunday because I find a couple of hours in the morning before the family wakes up to do my emails, but I don't expect you to wake up to those emails and start answering them.
And it's amazing how much just that simple statement can make a big difference, because most people in work culture, like, we're trained to mirror our boss and what our boss does. And if he's writing emails early, we write emails early. And if he's staying late, we stay late. And so it's really important to recognize that this is a big part of not just organizational culture, because a lot of companies think their organizational culture exists in a vacuum, but this is a lot of our work history. Outside of this individual company, we have an entire history where, again, for the last hundreds of years, we have promoted a very specific type of behavior, which is overwork. And that was highlighted. And the peak of that was during the 2008 financial crisis, where people were losing their jobs, and the people who kept their jobs were so grateful, A, to have a job that they didn't complain, and B, because companies were doing layoffs, the average person, research shows, was doing about a job and a half. So we developed this habit 10 years ago of doing 1.5 jobs. And then when the economy recovered, primarily recovered because of all the profits that companies are making, because they were able to get more done with less people, a lot of those companies didn't hire back those people. But the workload stayed the same.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to how you help your clients to find this balance between hustle and float. So you say having these conversations and making sure that the leaders, to start with, start role modeling the right behaviors is the first thing. What else do you do, or what else can our listeners do to find the right balance?
A lot of the times we take a look at the cultural beliefs, and the cultural beliefs are, I explain it as the gap between what leadership says and what leadership actually does. So you have to take a look at how in your own organizations, how people treat things like productivity, working late, leaving early. Like, what are the things that get unofficially rewarded and unofficially punished in the organization? Who are the people that get promoted? Who are the people that get rewarded? And who are the people that are idolized as, oh, this is like one of our best employees? And I had a client of mine that used to have, and again, unintentionally, used to have this employee of the month, but they always used to give it to this one guy who stayed really late all the time. And in their eyes, they just wanted to recognize his hard work. But the signal it was sending to everybody was that staying late was the only metric that mattered to get you visibility with management. So it's, it's funny. There isn't this 10-step program or an easy framework. It requires understanding our work history. It requires understanding why we resist certain changes, why we want to act in certain ways. And then it's about having very honest conversations with ourselves and with our teams. I mean, when you look at even yourself, it has a lot to do with ego and identity and our value as a human being. We have made work a central tenet of our society. It is incredibly it is linked with our identity, our self-worth, our status, our self-esteem, who we are, where we see ourselves. All of those things is linked to what we do. And if you start decoupling that a little, people get very nervous and they get very anxious, because we've spent so much time making this the central tenet of our lives that of course people are going to overcompensate in some ways. So you can't just tell people that they shouldn't work as much, because we all know we shouldn't, but we still do it anyway. It's better to really get to the root of that resistance. And I'll give you one more example, which is Netflix, the video streaming company. They had a policy put in place of unlimited paid vacation days, which sounds really great, right? Unlimited paid vacation days. But then they found out that a lot of people weren't taking those vacation days. Even though the policy was you could take as many paid vacation days as you want, people were not taking them. And when they investigated why, it turns out that they weren't afraid of what their managers would think. They were afraid of what their colleagues would think, that their colleagues would think that they weren't hardworking, that their colleagues would think that they didn't deserve a promotion. And so it's this type of like unspoken social rules that I found really fascinating, that I wanted to explore and that I wanted to understand how we could shift and alter.
Mm-hmm. So do you have an example to share with Christian and our listeners about a situation where you identify those beliefs and deep-seated assumptions and unwritten norms, and one of them, for example, is we work hard here and we stay long hours, and then how you help the client to rewire that conditioning in a way that enables, again, this balance between hustle and float?
Sure. So one of the clients that I worked with was a CEO, and she managed a team. Her direct reports were about 12 people. And she was just having a really hard time, what she said, finding people that were a good fit on her team. She had very, very high standards. And she had she was like very demanding as a boss. And so she had a high level of turnover, and she couldn't really understand why. And when we started digging into it, we started looking at the candidates, at the people on the team. These people were smart, intelligent, they were great on paper, they had the skill sets. So we were like, what's going on here? Why is it that you are unhappy with them? And she realized through these conversations that we had was that her own experience of being an entrepreneur and of building up her business had been one where she spent a lot of sleepless nights, where she was working 16-hour days. And she felt sort of subconsciously that if the people that she hired, she would get kind of annoyed if they left at 6 or 7 or 8 even, and she realized that she felt like if they weren't staying late enough, then they were signaling that they weren't as committed as she was to the dream of building this business. And it just made her feel like very angry and like sort of resentful. And then she'd have problems with these people. And then she'd let one of them go and like find another person who looked really great on paper. And then the same thing would happen over and over again. And what she realized was that this was about her work story and the story that she was telling herself about how the hard work that she did, that she put in, how that was like had become such a core part of her identity that she didn't really know who she was if she wasn't this person who like slept at the office. And that she just felt very alienated because she felt like her team didn't understand her. But in order to fix this, in order to move beyond this, she had to actually go back and do a lot of hard work on herself about figuring out other ways to identify that weren't linked to her pretty much ruining her health and ruining her relationships because she was always only at the office. And so that's an example where it's like your own attitude about your own beliefs, how you see yourself, your work ethic, your work identity, your work baggage, how that can manifest into an organizational culture where there was a lot of tension because the boss had all of these unspoken, unworded expectations that were coming from a place that she wasn't even aware they were coming from.
Absolutely, because as I say, the culture very often is the shadow of the leader. So people will look at them and whatever they say is going to be definitely less impactful than what they actually do. And I think a lot of organizations have the problem of the leaders either A, not having that awareness, how they contribute to a culture that is toxic, and B, then having the willingness, and you said she did have that willingness to do something about it. So do that deep work that might be required for you to change personally as a leader so that you can then, create a better, healthier environment for your team.
And the crazy thing is, and what I noticed in talking to people, looking at my own experiences, so much of these belief systems, I call them our operating system. They run in the background. We don't ever stop and question them. They color our entire worldview. They color how we view ourselves, how we measure our success, how we set our goals, how we look at who we admire. Like it sets everything. It sets our entire worldview, and we never stop and ask, where did these beliefs come from? Do they still serve us? Are they healthy? Do they help me? And once you start unraveling layer by layer by layer, you start to think of like, wow, I'm pushing myself for a certain ideal of success, especially when you look at, so one of the sections of the book looks at the stories we tell in the media, for example, our culture's mythology. Think of how entrepreneurs are mythologized. Think of how every time you read an article about Sheryl Sandberg or Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Beyonce, that it talks about how little they sleep, how many hours they spend at the office, how long they work. You know, Marissa Mayer used to sleep under her desk at Google. Elon Musk works, you know, over 100 hours a week every week.
He actually slept in the factory recently as well.
But this is like idolized. And this is the crazy thing. It's we hear these stories and they're not tales of caution. These are what it takes to represent the American dream, and these are what it takes to succeed. So these are the cultural figures that we have in our lives as our symbols of, you know, because symbols are just the sum of what our culture considers to be metrics of success. So if you look at the people, we are in an era where, you know, entrepreneurship and startups are just, and billion-dollar companies and unicorns, you know, they're just the ideal, this new ability. But when you look at how we talk about these entrepreneurs, if you look at a magazine rack next time you pass by it, how to get more done, how to be more productive, how to fit more into your day, 10 hacks to make you perform more, the 10 tips of highly productive people. This person wakes up at 3 a.m. every morning. This person doesn't sleep. This person sleeps at the factory. If you start paying attention, these stories are everywhere. And so I think we need to start talking about the stories, because we can't just fix this with policy, as Netflix saw. We can't just fix this with telling people that they have to work less or do something different. The only thing that will fix this is once we recognize the hold that these hidden forces have on us, then we can like move beyond them.
Totally. And from my experience, it's really, as you say, you can't just talk about these things. You have to enable people creating experiences where actually they can experience fulfillment and success in a different way, ideally collectively. So they do it together, they have this experience together. And then, of course, through that success, you can create a story that is worth telling and sharing with people, and you can, I guess, cross your fingers and hope for the viral effect in your company where people start talking to each other and saying, hey, you know, I actually left work earlier yesterday and went for a beer with my friends or whatever. And on the next day, I had this amazing insight because I was rested.
And the other thing, and I just like a whole different thing that we probably shouldn't get into, but the whole other thing is because we've made work as the central element of our lives with the upcoming technological revolution, technological disruptions, it's very, very clear to see that automation is on the horizon, and automation is going to make a lot of people's jobs obsolete. So what do we do when you have a society of workers, when work has become a religion? You have a society of workers who don't have work. And what do you do when who you are is forever linked to what you do? What do you do as a society? So we really need to start addressing these, not just from a nice to have, like it would nice to be rested, but from a need to have we need to address this as a society.
It is, it is imperative, absolutely. So I think that leads us nicely to Mike's question.
Hello, Aga. This is Mike Vacanti. I have a question for Rahaf, as you have her on the guest of your show. With technology becoming so much more powerful, rather than focusing on adoption, how well are organizations rethinking their operational processes to harness that power? Thank you. Love the podcast. Bye.
I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the learning organization. I think that the fundamental shift that has to happen is a shift that I say you have to stop thinking about about digital transformation and start thinking about digital evolution. Because digital transformation, semantically, the word, it means you go through this one change and you become transformed, right? And then that's it. And you would be surprised at how many clients I have just ask, so, once we finish this, our work's done, right? We can just like go back to business as usual. And it's like, no. This is why I said, forget digital transformation. Evolution, in contrast, by definition, is a continuous and never-ending set of changes where you're constantly adapting to changing environments. And in evolution, the job is never really done. You're constantly evolving and you're constantly reacting. And that mindset, I think, a digital evolution mindset is, I think, very different in an organization operationally than a digital transformation project. Because what you'll see is you'll see companies say, we're going to upgrade our technology. We're going to use this big data. We're going to launch a new website. Congratulations, we're digitally transformed. Versus what I think Mike's question alludes to, which is the strategy of digital evolution says, what do we need to do as an organization to ensure that we're always fostering the sense of adaptability? And that includes setting time aside in job descriptions in order to give people the chance to explore. That means investing in training. That means in investing in a sense of organizational ambiguity, where you can't expect people to record every minute of every day. Maybe people need a set amount of time every week of free time to just sit and think about where the business is going and how the market is changing. Instead, by forcing everyone to adhere to these productivity-oriented metrics, we say you have to justify what you're doing every single second of the day while you're at work. Your time sheets, we're going to track your time. But maybe what you need is you just need like an hour where you can sit and be like, okay, what's my business going to look like in the next 18 months? What's my business going to look like in 5 years? And who has the time now to stop and think, because we're all so busy?
Exactly. It's so true. And I completely resonate with what you said, transformation versus evolution. Actually, one of my services is culture evolution. Everyone is talking about culture transformation, but I completely agree with you that it's all about evolving it. And if you ever assume that you will be done with that, then basically you are setting yourself up for a failure there.
Yes.
So Jeff, our third listener.
Rahaf, hi, this is Jeff Wellstead. I got a quick question for you. In reading your book, The Dakota Company, you talked a lot about digital identity, as you did in a TED Talk that you did on a similar subject. For people who, especially younger generation executives who are entering the market, how do they go back and potentially course correct some of the early lapses in judgment potentially that some folks likely have had on things like Facebook and various social media sites, Instagram and Snapchat and so on and so forth? How do people go back basically and start to shape the digital presence that they want to market out to the world? Thank you.
So the most important thing that you can do for everybody, not just young executives, every person, is we need to be educated about the terms of services and what we are agreeing to, going back to those ethical data practices, what we're agreeing to when we use some of these platforms.
I think no one reads those.
No one reads them. And I think the companies count on that. There's a really great website, by the way, called, I think it's called TLDR, like too long didn't read, TOS. And what it is that they take all of the terms of service and they summarize them into like easy to understand, digestible graphics. So you really know. So the first step.
Fantastic. It's good to know. So we're going to post that link.
Post that link. And I'll try to get you the exact URL, but it's something along those lines. But the first thing before you can figure out how to fix your digital presence is to understand the boundaries of your digital presence and what you've given up and how long it gets stored and what companies do with it. So I would highly suggest that you get educated about the terms of service. You get educated, and there's lots of blog posts about this, about how you can protect your identity online, what security settings you need to have, if you need to use a VPN, how you can protect your online activities. Like all of these things are going to be very important for us, not just in correcting our identities in the past, but in moving forward and making sure that we're staying safe online. The third, obviously, is to just have to, and I know this sounds very, very basic, but I can't believe people don't fully absorb it, is that nothing on social media is private. No Facebook message, no chat message, no email, no text message. If you're putting it in writing, you have to put it in writing under the assumption that at some point in time, as my father used to tell us when we were kids, it could be plastered against the cover of the New York Times. So you do have to be aware. I see people, I get emails sometimes from people, from friends, sending me things that like I would never put in writing, you know? And as we've seen in different cases and different things, like all of a sudden, all your emails get brought up, your text messages get brought up, things get taken out of context. So really be aware that this expectation of privacy that we had, that your emails aren't private. And I know,
Yeah, I think it's important to say, because definitely that assumption about our emails, I mean, maybe some people don't even think about the fact that the things that they put on Facebook or Instagram might not be private, but there are definitely a lot of people who have the assumption that our emails are private. So I think it's important to underscore what you have just said, that actually they are not.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lady that was arrested for like trying to plot a murder on Facebook Messenger. But it's not private, lady. Like, what are you doing? But, so I think it's recognizing that our identities are extending into these digital spaces, but that, I always say break monopolies, right? So don't use your Facebook account to authenticate all your different accounts. Like use Twitter for some, use Google for some. Like so many people have everything, all their logins are all based on their Facebook account. So that's just more information that Facebook gets about you.
Okay, so let's go to the quick fire questions now. The idea is that I'm going to ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and you'll attempt to answer them in under 2 minutes. Okay. So the first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
It's the reality between what leadership says and what leadership does.
And what is a sign or signs that a company culture needs some work or even a major overhaul?
If people are tired, if people are quitting, if people are fighting on teams, then that means that there is some sort of cultural issue that needs to be addressed.
What company do you admire for their culture and why?
Costco, because they pay above the federal minimum wage, they pay for healthcare, they treat their employees like human beings.
What books on culture or leadership would you recommend?
That's a hard one.
Well, certainly yours.
I know, but I can't recommend just mine. That's so lame. I think one of my favorite books that I read was actually Don Tapscott's Growing Up Digital and Grown Up Digital. They're both really great books on how technology and the millennial generation are influencing companies. And I think they're excellent books.
Fabulous. So we'll post the links to those books as well in the show notes. And what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that helps them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
The easiest thing is to start setting aside like half an hour or an hour in your calendar of unstructured time where you can go and read and be curious and talk to people. Just time in your calendar that isn't taken over by to-dos and meetings and emails and calls.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of questions before we wrap it up. The first one is, I ask all our guests actually to recommend someone who you believe would be a great guest on the podcast, someone who either did a lot of interesting things around company culture or thinks or writes on the subject and would have a lot of useful stuff to share with our listeners.
I actually think that my co-author from the Dakota Company, all my co-authors, but like Liram Siegel, Jake Goldman, Aaron Goldberg, I think they are a fascinating study of culture and practice. When we wrote the book the Dakota Company, the Click Health was 400 people. So in 4 years, they've nearly doubled that. And they've managed to keep their culture steady, which is, I think, an incredible feat at such scale. So I think they would be incredible practitioners to have on your show.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So would you like to give our listeners any closing remarks in wrapping up?
Thank you for listening. I know we've jumped over all sorts of subjects. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I tend to do that when I get excited about the subject I'm talking about. But I think that we are all at the precipice of this incredible transformative time about the nature of work. And I think that it's more important than ever if you identify as a knowledge worker or as a productive creative or as a creative, that we start taking back a lot of these metrics and systems and focusing on creating cultures that enable us to do the work that we really want to do, that we feel compelled or called to do. Because if we just keep going along with these outdated systems, they're going to do more harm to our creativity than good.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And if our listeners want to find out more about Rahaf and your work, where should they go?
You can find me at rahafharfoush.com, or I'm Rahaf Harfoush at Twitter, or Pixel the Prancer on Instagram if you want to see Pixel, or I'm pretty easy to find. I'm all over the web. So please drop me a...
You should have a look at Pixel, definitely. She's
either
so
way,
cute.
like Twitter or email, I'm very easy to get a hold of. Would love to hear what your thoughts were on this interview. So please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Now, people have been leaving interviews on iTunes, and I just want to give a shout out to the Podcast Addict for his or hers, review. Podcast Addict says, I can't wait for more episodes of this podcast. The first 3 were really amazing, inspirational, engaging, and full of useful ideas. I feel motivated now to focus more on my choices, align with my values, and start shaping the culture in my team. Thank you, Podcast Addict, and it's wonderful to hear that you enjoy listening to the Culture Lab and that you intend to use some of those tips to shape culture in your team. For all of you listening to the podcast, we would be ever so grateful if you could take a moment and leave a review on iTunes or anywhere else that you listen to the podcast so that others can discover the Culture Lab. Thank you, Rahaf Harfoush, for being our guest, and thank you for listening. Thank you, our sound producer, James Eade from Be Heard, our manager, Lindsay Nunes, content contributor, Rachel Nice, and art director, Emily Spencer. And if you ever wondered if you could actually change the world, or at least a pocket of the world, the one that you truly care about, you should listen to my next interview with the incredibly inspiring Kate Kearns. She was named one of the top 50 women engineers for 2018 and an invisible superhero, and she has an incredibly moving personal story that led her to be one of those awesome movers and shakers who change culture in our workplaces and in our society.
Never believe that your voice is not enough. And it often just takes one person to stand up and say, this isn't good enough. Sometimes all it takes is a question. Why are we doing that? Do we really want to do it this way? Is this acceptable? Or are you going to go home and tell your family about your day today? Can you go home and look your daughter in the eyes and say, nobody has died today because of your work or your business? And what I found is I was very much a lone voice 9 or 10 years ago, and people would kind of say, don't be ridiculous, you can't change the design of a cab, which is the kind of attitude I had on site when I first started as a female engineer. Don't be ridiculous, love, we can't do it that way. We've been doing this for 20 years, and because we've been doing it for so long, people assume that's the way to do it. But as change accelerates, it's kind of foolish to think like that.
People are talking about building a coaching culture, a program that helps organizations embed coaching in their DNA.
The 2-day session for creating and building a coaching culture in the organization, the strategies we have learned is amazing.
An excellent session. It gave us a lot of examples, especially practical examples, and some of them I am definitely going to implement in my company.
It is a good starting point for creating a coaching culture in our organization, and it really had good examples that we can take on into our company.
Aga is very knowledgeable. She has the talent of passing this knowledge over to us. Surely this is a session I fully recommend.
Very, very good coach. I have, other people to compare, and I think she's a very, very good, excellent coach.
The seminar was very insightful, empowering, and inspirational. Aga is a great tutor and an amazing coach. So it's the items that I got from this seminar, I can implement them also personally and professionally.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.